Absolutely amazing. Thank you. Isn't it interesting how when we're really waiting for something, the way that our whole lives tend to rearrange around the thing that we are waiting for? As those of you who have ever had a baby or been close to someone who has, I imagine you can attest to the fact that some interesting things happen when you're expecting, don't they? Internal things, external things, physical things, emotional things, things that are normal, things that are not so normal, things that are quite inexplicable. There's that whole nesting instinct that happens, all the physical changes that come about. And then there are those weird cravings. Did any of you have any strange cravings when you were pregnant? Anyone here willing to share what some of those strange cravings may have been? Ruth Ann? Red licorice. Oh, that's good at any time. Anyone else willing to share one of your cravings when you were pregnant? Yeah. Between you two, I could just live on those two things all day. There's nothing strange about that. Nice. Anyone else willing? Yeah. Pickled artichoke hearts. Yum. This all sounds way too good. This just sounds like a wonderful banquet to me. Anyone else? Well, Reddit magazine did a survey of all of their readers of the weirdest things that they craved during their pregnancy, and they made a top 10 list. Do you want to see it? You have no choice. Okay. Number 1, cottage cheese with mustard. How does that sound? Number 9, eating the frost out of the freezer. One woman said she did it all the time, and even when she was at work, she would fantasize about going home and eating the frost. Number 8, drinking gravy right out of the bowl. This woman said it started with putting gravy on her meat and her mashed potatoes, and then she would drench the bread in it, and then before long she was just drinking it right out of the bowl. Number 7, the cheese packet in a Kraft macaroni and cheese box. That's disgusting. Okay. Number 6, raw ground beef. In some cultures, this is a delicacy. This is beef tartare. Well, let's go on to 5. Sucking on a wet washcloth or sponge. There was one woman that said anytime she was washing the dishes or in the bath, she couldn't help but to suck on the sponge. Oh my gosh, Charlotte's about to throw up. Sorry, Charlotte. Number 4, spaghetti sandwich with mayo and garlic powder. Number 3. Oh, this is runny eggs. Runny eggs on Chip Ahoy cookies. Number 2, a Snickers bar wrapped in bacon. I see nothing wrong with that. That sounds really good to me. Everything tastes better when it's wrapped in bacon. And the number 1, vanilla ice cream smothered in baked beans. There are some odd things that we think about, that we do when we are expecting. Isn't it the case? Facebook had a page, they called it Mommy Poppins, of women, some of the interesting thoughts they had, and they turned them into cartoons. And here's a couple of those. Maternity clothes are regular clothes with a 200% markup. Next. The birth video they show in birthing class can make a Quentin Tarantino film look like a Disney movie. The what fruit does your baby look like this week is both cute and creepy. Yvette and I, we did this. She had one of those websites where they told you what to expect every day through the 9 months, and every week they updated the fruit, and so we always were, so how's my little kumquat today? How's my little avocado or mango? And then finally, I love this one. For the 9 months I am pregnant with a boy, shouldn't I be paid 1.78 times my salary? Very good. There are so many things that happen inside of us when we are expecting. I remember when Yvette was pregnant for the first time, so many changes that happened to both of us in those 9 months as God was preparing us to be the people we needed to be the parents of Ryan and then eventually Clayton as well. One thing that I think all women have in common is that by the end of this 40 or so week journey, pretty much all of them are ready for it to be over with. Isn't that true? Well, can you imagine if you were expecting a baby for a little over 700 years? That's exactly what was going on with Israel. In 734 BC, they were in a pretty tight spot. The northern kingdom had already been conquered by the Assyrian Empire, the strongest and largest empire in the world at that time. And they had been carried off into exile, and the southern kingdom of Judah was not far behind. They were on sort of shaky ground, and King Ahaz knew it. But at the same time, at the exact same moment, they were also in a hot war with two of their smaller neighbors, Syria and Ephraim. And these two countries were laying siege to Jerusalem and trying to overtake the walls. And so Ahaz found himself caught between a rock and a hard place in this very tough predicament. He knew that he could at any time dispatch a messenger to the Assyrian Empire, and they would all too happily come in and rescue Israel from their neighbors. But it would come at a very high cost of becoming a vassal of Assyria. And so Ahaz isn't sure what to do, and he's desperate, and he's trying everything he can, and he's praying to God, and he's trying to figure out if he should wait or not. And one day he goes down to the aqueducts to figure out how much water they have left, how much longer Jerusalem can hold out before it's destroyed. And on the way he meets a man named Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah tries to urge Ahaz not to give in. He tells him that he can wait for God, that God can be trusted, that God will rescue and deliver Israel. Isaiah says, God has actually told me to ask you what sign you want, because God will show you any sign you want to prove to you that God can be trusted, to prove that you can wait on God and God will deliver you. And of course, Ahaz is a little bit skeptical because I think, as you all know, throughout the scripture, everywhere we turn, what does it say? You shall not test your God. You shall not ask for a sign. And here's Isaiah saying, God has told me to ask you for any sign, God will give it to you. And so Ahaz says to Isaiah, well, actually, there's no way I can do that because it wouldn't be right for me to test my God. And Isaiah kind of rolls his eyes, and it's kind of almost funny. He says, okay, Ahaz, now you are really getting on God's last nerve. That's not the direct translation, but what it actually says is, are you now going to try the patience not only of humans, but of God as well? And then Isaiah says, look, God is going to give you a sign. The virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son. And that son shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. And a few verses later, he says this. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle, and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The greatness of his government and peace of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness. From that time on and forever, the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. There are things that happen inside of us while we are waiting. But can you imagine waiting 734 years? I don't know how you are about waiting. If you're anything like the rest of us, it's probably not on your top 10 list. I recently heard about a new term here in LA called a honkosecond. It's the amount of time it takes in Los Angeles from when the light turns green till the first person starts honking their horn. Do you think it's any coincidence that the Bible is filled with story after story about waiting? That from cover to cover, the Bible is constantly telling us to wait on the Lord, commanding us to wait patiently. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will rise up on wings like eagles. I'm waiting for this cough to one day go away. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the slimy pit. My soul waits for the Lord. My soul waits for the Lord. More than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning. From the very beginning, we have the story of Abraham, and at the age of 75 years old, he's told to expect a son. Excuse me. And it takes another 24 years before that promise comes to fruition. And then the people of Israel, and being promised to be freed from Egypt for 400 years, and then when they're finally freed, it's another 40 years in the wilderness as they wait and prepare to be ready for the promise given to them. And then in 734, oh, thank you. And then in 734, when Isaiah promises that this Messiah, this child, will be born, and yet it's another 734 years until that promise comes to fruition. Something happens inside of us when we're waiting for the promise. Today marks the beginning of the Advent season, this 4-week season of preparation and expectation as we wait for this child to be born. But it's not just a passive kind of waiting. It's a very active waiting in which God, if we will allow it, God will work in us and change us and rearrange our lives so that we might be shaped and molded into a vessel, into a manger, that this child can be born in, that this child can be born into our lives and out into the world through us. I think one of the lessons, the main lessons of this season is that God is not trying to help you get somewhere. God is trying to help you become something. When you wait, things change inside of you. As you wait, you start to rearrange your life around the things that you wait for. You start to see things in a new way. You start to be given a new perspective. You start to let go of your own agenda, and you start to allow God to do things in you and through you that you never even realized before. There's something about the things that we wait for that shape us, that help us to become who we are and what we were meant to be in this world. But it's not easy. Recently, I heard a story about a CEO who had to wait for a long time in the doctor's office, and so he went back to his office and he sent the doctor a bill for his time. Wouldn't you love to be able to do that? Not very humble, but it sure would be fun, wouldn't it? And yet I've experienced just the opposite from you all over these last 11 years as I've sat in surgery waiting rooms or emergency rooms with you all, and I have seen you all, the willingness you have to just sit there and wait attentively on the edge of your seats for hours at a time, maybe even all night, just to hear one word on how your loved one is doing. The way that you all, people who are busy and usually don't have to wait for anything, people who aren't used to having to wait on things, who are willing to just, without hesitation, cancel all of the plans you have and just sit there and be there attentively. I know you know what I'm talking about. Something very powerful happens inside of us as we wait. I think one of the most important lessons of this whole Advent and Christmas season is that the waiting itself changes us. And that the waiting itself many times is just as important or even more important than the thing that we are waiting for. Isn't that true? It was so interesting with Israel. They had to wait all of this time, and they were in exile, and they felt like all of their hopes and dreams had been dashed, and yet God was doing something inside of them that prepared them for the coming of this Messiah. They had no idea what the Messiah would be like. In fact, most of the thoughts they had about what the Messiah would be were completely wrong. And yet it was during this time in the exile that so much began to change for the nation of Israel. They started seeing God and community and government and politics in a completely new way. It was during this time that the Zionist theology began to collapse. They no longer believed that God could only live in Israel and only live in Jerusalem and in the temple. It was during this time that they started to actually believe that no matter where they went around the world, that God would come with them. That God could be with them in the midst of their exile, in the midst of their failures, in the midst of their broken and shattered dreams and hopes. It was during this time that God became so much more personal to them, and they started questioning the whole idea of the animal sacrifices. Why did they need to kill an animal to somehow make them feel better about the bad things that they had done? And they started thinking about a time when maybe there would be one final sacrifice for all time. It was during this time that the synagogues began, and the focus of their worship became more centered in the community and in a personal, heartfelt connection with God. It was during this time that the Word became so much more important to them, and it was during this time when things were changing and they were learning so much about themselves and about God that they wrote and rewrote and refined so much of the Old Testament as we understand it today. It was in the exile that the priestly source of the Pentateuch was written. All of Deuteronomy, of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Deuteronomy, 2 Kings, all written during that time. They didn't know what the Messiah was going to be like, but everything that was happening to them as they were waiting, the way that God was working in them as they were waiting, it was just getting them ready for Jesus and his ministry and this new covenant that he was going to be introducing. And so the question is, what is it that you are waiting for this Christmas season? True love, a new job, a new purpose, or calling in your life? I know some of you are waiting for your kids to come home from school so you can be reunited again. Others are waiting for broken relationships to be healed, for old friendships to be rekindled. Some of you are waiting for a doctor's test result to come back, or to see if a surgery that you've had is going to stick. I know some of you are dealing in that sandwich generation with your kids on one end and your parents on the other. In fact, some of you are in a place where you feel like you're just in a holding pattern waiting for your parents to die. Or others of you have already lost the love of your life and your best friend, and you're just waiting for the chance to go and be reunited with them. And yet so much of who we are and what it is that we are becoming is being shaped in the waiting itself. Lewis Smedes, the theologian, writes this: waiting is our destiny as creatures who cannot by themselves bring about what we hope for. We wait in the darkness for a flame that we can't light. We wait in fear for a happy ending we can't write. We wait for a not yet that feels like a not ever. Waiting is the hardest work of hope. I love that. Waiting is the hardest work of hope. What is it that you are waiting for this Christmas season? And how is that waiting shaping your life? These are two of the most important questions that we will ever ask ourselves. Because who we are and who we're becoming, what we do, our accomplishments, our achievements, our actions, our personalities, our character, are all being formed by the things that we are waiting for. In this Advent season, if you allow yourself, if you carve out the time and you make the space for you to wait for this Christ child to be born again, God will work inside of you. God will help you, will fashion you and mold you into a vessel through which this child can be born once again, not only into your own life, but into the world around you, if you will allow it. If you will set aside the time to wait. If you will allow God to make you the manger that the Christ child can be born in again. Amen.